What's the creepiest place you've been? An abandoned mental institution in New Jersey. My friend brought us there and we wandered the grounds and went in a few buildings, including the morgue. The offices still had patient files, and the pediatric area still had kids' artwork. It had been abandoned for about 8 years at that point. It was really creepy and also really sad. Ernestine and Hazel's in Memphis. Old blues bar that Ray Charles played at back in the day, and prior to that was a brothel at one point, ran by two sisters, Ernestine and Hazel. Later, we find the place is reportedly haunted. We had a few beers and ate possibly the best handmade hamburger I've ever had. We venture upstairs, which still looked like an old boarding house with dark-colored beadboard on the walls and ceiling. It was darkly lit with empty rooms filled with dim-colored lights, broken pianos, jukeboxes, odd furniture, broken desks, etc. The upstairs bathroom had a clawfoot tub with a single red light bulb in there. It felt like a murder scene. We were buzzed, but I still felt a bit uneasy up there. There was one door closed and you could tell someone was in there. Figured it was the office or something. The end of the hallway had an upstairs bar that we chilled at for a while and left soon after. A few months later I read about the owner, who lived upstairs, and was probably who I saw in that upstairs room, committed suicide in that very room. It was a very cool place, but I will probably never go back in there. I explored the abandoned Six Flags in New Orleans. It was closed for Katrina and never opened again. While my friends and I were there, we found everything essentially as it was left 4 years prior. Computers in the admin office, tickets in admission booth, even jars of fucking pickles in the concession stands. I had a friend who cleaned out and sold foreclosed homes for a living. He once took me on a ride to a house he had to photograph for the bank after it had gone into foreclosure. From the moment we got there, it was unsettling. It was in the area of a ski resort, and the neighborhood was wealthy, but once we stepped inside, it was clear that it had been used as a kind of boarding house for resort staff. Numbers outside each of the bedroom doors, large closets, weird spaces turned into bedrooms. The place was filthy, with black garbage bags everywhere, pizza boxes, booze bottles, like clearly a party house for staff, but recently abandoned. At one point, I was on the ground floor, and my friend was in the basement, when I suddenly got full body chills. I was standing in the kitchen and there was a bathroom next to it with the door closed, and I somehow knew that there was someone hiding in that bathroom. At the very same instant, my friend called me down to the basement where he had found a back corner which had been converted into another sleeping area. There was a television still on, just showing static, and a kitchen knife on a crate next to the mattress. That was the moment I stepped directly behind my 6 feet 4 inches, 300 pounds friend, and told him we had to get the fuck out of there. I'm pretty sure the home was being used as an illegal boarding house for undocumented resort workers, and I honestly felt bad for the terrified kid who was still squatting in the basement, but I sure as hell didn't want to find him. I went to an interview shortly out of grad school. I'm a librarian, and it was a cataloging job. It was located outside of the city, on a remote country road. There were no other buildings or houses located nearby. The address was a house. I was desperate enough to not turn around and drive away. I get up to the porch, and there was a very large dog waiting in the mud room. I knocked on the door, and out comes this Norman Bates type, and he starts touring me around the main floor of the house, which is set up as an office, explaining to me that mother is the supervisor. Seriously, you can't fucking make this shit up. The place is musty, and has a Bates Motel meets the office decor. By the time he takes me out the back deck to very rusty, dirty white antique deck furniture, I'm thinking, WTAF am I doing here? Am I going to be murdered? And then he gives me a test for cataloging, the most normal thing so far, and once I finish it, explains Mother's rules. She's super strict about a lot of things, but especially the dog. No complaints about dog, ever. I go back through the house with him, and sure enough, there is a photo on the wall of Mr. Batestm and mother. I got the hell out of there, and ignored further emails from him. The moral of the story is that you shouldn't apply to random jobs without researching. My mother works with Holocaust survivors. One day someone contacted her about a bag of ashes from Dachau. This woman's relative had died, and in his belongings, they found an envelope with the bag of ashes inside with some notes. The relative had supposedly been doing some heavy shit for the American military during the war. The woman had no idea what to do with them, so she contacted the JFCS, and that's how my mother ended up with the ashes. I was maybe 14 at the time. We bought a small wooden box and placed the ashes there, and they sat on the entertainment center for 2 days. I am crying now as I type this because I remember that my mother and I stayed up very late that night, saying all of the different kinds of prayers we could. With such little information, there was no telling if this was one person, or if this was many. My mother had done this job for many years, and I had already heard so many horrifying stories, but something about having those ashes in our presence was honestly, there are no words for that impact. We contacted all of the congregations in the area and basically had a big funeral. It got some news coverage. It was a different type of mourning. My own attic when I was 8. Shut the lights off on your way out and sprint down the steps like the ceiling is collapsing behind you. Whoever says childhood is fun and beautiful is wrong, it's terrifying. The solitary confinement cells at Alcatraz, which is a pretty creepy place all on its own. But those cells are like the heart of darkness. There are 4 or 5 of them just off the library, all the cell doors open onto a windowless hallway, so it's dark leading to dark. I went in there on my own, and I swear something evil was squatting in the corner waiting for me, leave my soul unattended. 10 for creepy, will not go back. When I was in Iceland, I walked past a school at roughly 9 o'clock-ish in the morning and heard children laughing. It was very dark out, and I didn't know I was near a school. The combination of the sudden sound of children's laughter coupled with the darkness created one of very few occasions I have felt unsettled like that. Kids should only be allowed to laugh in groups during daylight, in plain sight. I responded to a similar question a few months ago that was directed to police officers and our creepiest experiences, and I responded with a story about a pedophile I caught trying to break into a rural home occupied at the time by 2 teenagers whose folks were out of town. Up until about 2 months ago, that was the creepiest event I had experienced, but I recently experienced the creepiest place I had ever been as well as the creepiest experience I've ever had. So, my fellow constable and I had a lunch break at the same time, and we met up at a little rest area off one of the county line roads. Window to window, typical cop shit, and we're chatting and eating. He tells me he got the new set of spike strips for stopping fleeing vehicles, for those that don't know, and he's like, oh come look, they've got a better egress handle. I pull up a bit so I can get out at his trunk, and he shows me, and we're admiring the new kit, and I don't know why the hell he noticed this, but for some reason there were human tracks leading into the wooded area off to our right about 5 meters away. Just beyond where the trees start there's a barbed wire fence, and the area is provincial property, and it's not accessible to public. Reason being, there's an old abandoned mining town down about 10 minutes into the woods. We radio about possible trespassers and we go slogging into the woods. We get there and this place looks like some shit out of that episode of Looney Tunes, where Bugs Bunny and Yosemite Sam are braving the Klondike Gold Rush. Only creepy and, well, empty. Tracks lead toward the mine itself. Of course it does. Why wouldn't it? We get to the mine entrance and waltz in like we own the place, and there's all these old chains and shit hanging from the ceiling of the cave, and it smells like ammonia from animal piss. Bunch of old wooded construction stations strewn everywhere. Creepy. Yeah, well then we turned the flashlights on, and both of us nearly shat a sea turtle. There were 4 mannequins in Native American garb in a semicircle around a dais with some sort of bovine skull, and just a bunch of charred wood and shit laying around, and the mannequins were painted with eyes and such. No people around though. I guarantee goddamn to you the screech we heard was from wind passing through a crevice in the cave wall, but we both, again, nearly shat a marine reptile. Decided F this, day shift can deal with this crap. Yeah, anyway, that was the creepiest crap I've ever experienced. Maybe it wasn't even that creepy? Maybe I'm a little bitch? All I know was it startled the piss out of me. More or less a combination of creepy and sad, but Cambodia. Went with family to see Angkor Wat, huge temple, an absolute marvel, was featured in Tomb Raider I believe, and stopped in the town center for a bite to eat with our guide. We wandered away from the guide just to explore a bit, and we were approached by a young girl, 15 to 16, carrying what looked to be a sleeping toddler. She asked us to buy milk for her baby, and we obliged because hey, babies need food. Just as we were about to walk into the store, our guide spots us and tells us to get in his car. We used it for transportation to and from a bunch of temples. The girl then starts screaming profanities at us and the guide, and we pile into our car. She started banging on the windows of the car, while still screaming, after the door was closed, and surprisingly enough the toddler still didn't wake up. We asked our guide WTF just happened, and he relayed this to us. Apparently in Cambodia and some other countries, gangs will profit off of not only sex trafficking from children, but also a form of pity trafficking. They will take a small child, toddler, and drug them so they look as though they're sleeping. They'll pass the child off to a young girl who will beg for food money etc. and pose as the toddler's mother. Then, she'll pass the child off to a new girl who will repeat the act. They do this until the child wakes up, will feed them, and then start the process again. As the toddlers get older, they'll be taught to try and sell things to tourists. If they fail to meet a quota, they'll sometimes lose limbs, fingers, hands, arms, legs, and will then run a story about how they stepped on an old landmine. This is actually somewhat possible as the country is still reeling from the impact Pol Pot had, and there are still unearthed landmines, but the issue is that less than 1% are close to the main city Angkor Wat, which is where a majority of these children were. We were shocked to say the least. This seemed kind of far-fetched, but what else would we believe? We did some research online and found stuff about the sex trafficking but not much about the toddler swapping and child mutilation. When we went into town the next day with our guide, what did we see? The same toddler being passed to a different girl, still knocked out, still in the same clothing. Definitely creepy. I loved Angkor Wat and thought it was beautiful, but I don't plan on going back there anytime soon.